Everybody knows the sad story of the Titanic thanks to the iconic film that dramatized the tragic love of two of the passengers.
I'll never let go. I promise.
However, after many decades, a cache of photos previously buried but recently discovered has been shedding more light on the nature of the famous maritime disaster. What do the photos reveal and what have we learned from the disaster? In this video, we shine the light on an old camera found in the deep ocean that contains horrifying photos of the Titanic. It is safe to say no other ship in history has achieved the popularity of the Titanic. While it was majestic in its own right, its claim to fame lies in a tragedy that claimed the lives of thousands of people. The ultra-luxury steamship RMS Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15, 1912 off the coast of Newfoundland in the North Atlantic after colliding with an iceberg on its maiden voyage. The Titanic's story has inspired countless books, articles, and films, including the 1997 blockbuster Titanic film starring Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. But outside the entertainment circles, the ship's story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of human hubris. What many people don't know is that the Titanic was the result of intense competition between competing ship lines in the first half of the 20th century. The White Star Line in particular found itself in a steamship primacy battle with the Cunard, an experienced British firm with two standout ships that are among the most sophisticated and luxurious of their time. Cunard's Mauretania first set a speed record for the fastest average speed during a transatlantic crossing, 23.69 knots or 27.26 miles per hour in 1907, a record it held for 22 years. J. Bruce Ismay, chief executive of White Star, discussed the construction of three large ships with William J. Pirrie, chairman of the shipbuilding company Harland and Wolff, the same year Cunard unveiled its two magnificent liners. Each ship in the new Olympic class of liners would be 882 feet long and 92.5 feet wide at their widest point, making them the largest of their time. Work on the second of these three ocean liners, Titanic, began in March 1909 at the massive Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, and continued non-stop for 2 years. On May 31, 1911, the Titanic's massive hull, which was the largest movable man-made object in the world at the time, slid down the slipways and into Belfast's River Lagan. Over 100,000 people turned out for the launch, which took just over a minute and went off without a hitch. The hull was immediately towed to a massive fitting-out dock, where thousands of workers would spend the next year constructing the ship's decks, lavish interiors, and the 29 massive boilers that would power her two main steam engines. When the Titanic set sail from Southampton, England on April 10, 1912, it caused quite a stir. Following stops in Cherbourg, France and Queenstown, Ireland, the ship set sail for New York with 2,240 passengers and crew, or souls, as the term was used in the shipping industry at the time, usually in connection with a sinking on board. Many of these souls were high-ranking officials, wealthy industrialists, dignitaries and celebrities, as befitting the world's most celebrated ship's first transatlantic crossing. J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, was the first to arrive, accompanied by Thomas Andrews, the ship's builder from Harland and Wolff. J.P. Morgan, whose International Mercantile Marine Shipping Trust controlled the White Star Line and had appointed Ismay as a company officer, was not present. Morgan had planned to join his colleagues on the Titanic but had to cancel at the last minute due to a business matter. The wealthiest passenger was John Jacob Astor IV, heir to the Astor fortune, who had made headlines a year earlier when he married Madeline Talmadge Force, a young woman 29 years his junior, shortly after divorcing his first wife. Other notable passengers included Isidor Straus, the elderly owner of Macy's, and his wife Ida, who are represented in the Titanic film. Industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim, who was accompanied by his mistress, valet and chauffeur, and the widow and heiress Margaret Molly Brown, who earned the moniker the Unsinkable Molly Brown by helping to maintain calm and order while the lifeboats were being loaded and boosting the spirits of her fellow survivors. The employees who attended to this group of first-class luminaries were mostly traveling second class, along with academics, tourists, journalists, and others who would receive service and accommodations comparable to first class on most other ships. However, the largest group of passengers was in third class, with over 700 passengers, outnumbering the other two levels combined. Some had paid less than $20 to cross the ocean. Third class was the main source of profit for shipping lines like White Star, and Titanic was designed to provide these passengers with accommodation and amenities that were superior to those found on any other ship at the time. After 4 days of uneventful sailing, the Titanic received sporadic reports of ice from other ships, but she was sailing on calm seas under a moonless, clear sky. A lookout saw an iceberg coming out of a slight haze dead ahead at about 11:30 p.m., rang the warning bell, and phoned the bridge. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship was sharply turned. Rather than colliding directly with the berg, Titanic appeared to graze along its side, sprinkling ice fragments on the forward deck. The lookouts were relieved when they saw no collision. However, there was something they didn't know. The iceberg had a jagged underwater spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in the ship's hull below the waterline. But by the time the captain and Harland and Wolff's Thomas Andrews toured the damaged area, 5 compartments were already filling with seawater. The bow of the doomed ship was alarmingly pitched downward, allowing seawater to pour from one bulkhead into the next. Andrews quickly calculated that the Titanic could float for an hour and a half, perhaps slightly longer. The captain, who had already instructed his wireless operator to call for assistance, then ordered the lifeboats to be loaded. That was when the pandemonium started. About an hour after hitting the iceberg, an embarrassingly disorganized and haphazard evacuation began. The ship's lifeboats were designed to carry 65 people each, but only 28 made it into the initial lifeboats, a great wastage of precious time and resources. Tragically, this precedent became the hallmark of the rescue operation. During the confusion and chaos preceding Titanic's sinking, nearly every lifeboat would be launched woefully underfilled, some with only a handful of passengers. Following the law of the sea, women and children boarded the boats first. The men were allowed to board only when there were no women or children nearby. Despite this, many of the victims were women and children as a result of chaotic procedures that failed to get them to the boats in the first place. One bright spot, however, was that the Titanic stayed afloat for nearly 3 hours, exceeding Andrews' prediction. And during those hours, the ship witnessed both craven cowardice and extraordinary bravery, some of which the popular Titanic film captured and immortalized. Between the order to load the lifeboats and the ship's final plunge, hundreds of human dramas played out. Men parted with spouses and children, families were split up in the chaos, and selfless people gave up their seats to stay with loved ones or allow a more vulnerable passenger to escape. In the end, only 706 people survived the Titanic's sinking. The Titanic's most famous passengers all reacted to the situation in ways that have become part of the Titanic legend. Ismay, the managing director of White Star, assisted in loading some of the boats and later stepped on to a collapsible as it was being lowered. To be fair, he only abandoned the ship when no women or children were present. However, he would never live down the humiliation of surviving the disaster while so many others died. The Titanic's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring blankly at a ship painting on the wall. Astor loaded his pregnant wife, Madeline, into a lifeboat and asked if he could accompany her. However, he was refused entry, but he managed to kiss her goodbye just before the boat was lowered away. Despite being offered a seat due to his age, Isidor Strauss refused, and his wife, Ida, refused to leave her husband behind. The two retired to their cabin and died together. When Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet returned to their rooms and changed into formal evening attire, he famously declared, "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." And then there was Molly Brown, who assisted in loading the boats and was eventually forced to be one of the last to depart. She passionately begged the ship's crew to return for survivors, but they refused, fearing they would be swamped by people desperate to escape certain death in the icy seas. The Titanic finally sank beneath the ocean's surface on April 15, 1912, nearly perpendicular and with many of her lights still aglow. After receiving the Titanic's distress call at midnight and steaming at full speed all night while dodging ice floes, Cunard's Carpathia rounded up all of the lifeboats throughout the morning. They only had 705 survivors. While it has long been assumed that the ship sank due to the gash that caused the bulkhead compartments to flood, various other theories have emerged over the years, including that the ship's steel plates were too brittle for the near-freezing Atlantic waters, that the impact caused rivets to pop, and that the expansion joints failed, among others. But stepping aside from the technological aspects of the disaster for a moment, the Titanic's demise has taken on a deeper, almost mythic significance in popular culture. For example, many people see the tragedy as a morality play about the dangers of human arrogance. The Titanic's designers believed they had built an unsinkable ship that could not be defeated by natural laws. Basically, don't say it can never be, because the universe has a way of proving it can always be you. This same overconfidence explains the electrifying impact the Titanic's sinking had on the public when she was lost. Looking back, there was shocking, widespread disbelief that the ship could not possibly have sunk, and coupled with the era's slow and unreliable means of communication, misinformation abounded. Hey, there was no social media or the internet to spread pictures as the disaster unfolded. The Titanic's departure from Southampton on April 10, 1912 was not without incidents that should have raised eyebrows. A small coal fire was discovered in one of her bunkers, which was a frightening but common occurrence on steamships at the time. To get to the bottom of the blaze, firefighters hosed down the smoldering coal and shoveled it aside. After assessing the situation, the captain and chief engineer determined that it was unlikely that any damage to the hull structure had occurred, and the stokers were directed to continue controlling the fire at sea. There is, however, another fresh look at the disaster offered by journalist Shannon Maloney, who got access to a previously unknown collection of photos of the Titanic before it even left the shipyard. These photos remained forgotten in an attic before Maloney got his hands on them and would have remained forever lost. They originally belonged to John Kempster, Titanic's chief electrical designer. A descendant of Kempster brought the old photos to an auction. The auction house wanted to sell the photos one by one, but a collector was able to strike a deal. Maloney has studied the Titanic tragedy for more than 30 years, and his insights are very interesting. One of these images shows an ominous 30-foot-long dark mark on the ship's hull, exactly where the iceberg was known to have struck. Engineers at the Imperial College of London determined that the mark was caused by a coal fire in the ship's 3-story high coal bunker. To be fair, it was well documented that a coal fire was burning aboard. During the post-sink investigation, Hendrickson was called to testify about the fire. The fire was discovered before the Titanic set sail from Belfast. Hendrickson and 3 or 4 other men worked to extinguish the fire, but the only way to do so in a bunker like this was to throw the burning coal into a ship's furnace. So how come they couldn't just put out the fire? Because that's not how things work. Coal is very flammable, and even under the best of circumstances, dealing with a coal fire is extremely difficult. Even with all of the world's resources and plenty of room to work, they can be nearly impossible to extinguish. Consider the coal fire in Centralia, Pennsylvania, for example. This fire started in a mine in the northeast United States and has proven impossible to extinguish and has been burning for more than 60 years. Despite numerous efforts, nothing has been able to put out the fire. Some areas of the fire are estimated to be around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, producing a lethal carbon monoxide gas clouds. Eventually, the federal government gave up trying to put out the fire and simply purchased all of the land from the displaced residents. Centralia is now a tourist destination, with people coming to see the smoke and abandoned buildings. So imagine how difficult it would be on a ship with a limited space. No matter how large the Titanic was, it was still a ship. Going back to Maloney's discovery, the area in the coal bunker where the fire started was against one of the ship's main bulkheads. These are watertight walls that prevent seawater from spreading in the event of a hull breach. Maloney spoke with Guillermo Rhine of the Imperial College of London, a fire science expert. According to Rhine, the temperature of the Titanic's fire could have reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Rhine also claimed that by the time a coal fire is discovered, it's most likely been burning for days or weeks. The testimony of the Titanic's coal stokers and firefighters appears to indicate that the fire severely damaged the bulkhead near the coal area. Some even reported metal movement or buckling. There was no attempt to repair the damage, and according to the previous image, there is also a visible mark on the hull from the fire damage. Another problem with the Titanic was its speed. Despite warnings of icebergs in the area, it was traveling at full speed across the Atlantic Ocean. There were rumors that the ship was attempting to set a speed record, but the Titanic was not designed for speed. The massive vessel was a luxury liner. But according to Maloney, the excessive speed could have been caused by the onboard firefighting. How could firefighting cause overspeeding? Well, the stokers had been shoveling burning coal into furnaces to burn the fire away in order to fight the fire. If the stokers were shoveling as much coal as they could, then that would explain the ship's speed. As more coal burned, the engines worked harder, increasing speed. For 3 days, the stokers had been shoveling coal into the furnaces non-stop to put out the fire. Maloney believes this is why the ship was traveling at full speed when it collided with the iceberg. Maloney also studied a transcript of the American inquiry into the sinking in which lead firefighter stoker Fred Barrett reported a failure of the bulkhead. Barrett was below when the iceberg struck and took refuge in another watertight compartment of the ship. It was actually standing behind the bulkhead that had been damaged by the fire. Barrett saw a wave of green foam come tearing between the boilers about 2 hours later. Barrett was able to escape the incoming torrent of water because the bulkhead failed at this point. According to Maloney's investigation, the ship began sinking rapidly after this event. Maloney's argument, based on the photos he discovered, is simple and logical. A bulkhead was damaged as a result of the hidden fire. The increased speed was caused by the excessive use of coal to combat the fire, and the failure of the bulkhead was caused by the tremendous heat generated by the coal fire which was directly against it. If the bulkheads had held, Maloney believes that the passengers on the ship could have been saved. A ship had been summoned and was on its way to help, so if the Titanic had managed to stay afloat for a few more hours, the magnitude of the historic disaster could have been avoided. The bulkheads were the Titanic's primary line of defense against the elements. In fact, the Titanic's lack of lifeboats was explained by the fact that the ship itself was thought to be a lifeboat. The bulkheads were designed to keep water out in the event of a breach, giving time for a rescue. However, if the bulkheads failed, disaster was unavoidable. One question, however, remains. Why would the ship leave port with a fire on board? Maloney looked into this as well. According to interviews and research into the White Star Line, the company appeared to be in financial trouble. The Titanic's debut had already been delayed and its sister ship had been damaged, resulting in additional economic losses. The Titanic had to sail on time or the company would have imploded. In hindsight, the official inquiry into the disaster downplayed some key aspects. Maloney said that the Board of Trade Marine Inspector Maurice Clark told the inquiry that the fire was kept from him. He had the authority to prevent the ship from sailing, and based on another case involving another transatlantic liner, he was supposed to have done just that. The fact that the British inquiry suppressed consideration of an uncontrolled fire should come as no surprise, especially since some of the Titanic inquiry's judicial makeup had previously ruled in the case of the Cairn Rona that she should not have gone to sea with a spontaneous coal fire in her bunkers in 1910. The Cairn Rona experienced an explosion, fatalities, and panic. The discovery was communicated to all shipping companies, but the Titanic sailed 2 years later with her coal in worse condition. The pictures also present the luxurious nature of the Titanic from a different perspective. It is obvious that the builders raised the bar even for the lowest class of passengers. The Titanic's crowning glory was the Grand Staircase. The Grand Staircase, made of polished oak, wrought iron, and a variety of boutique glass, was built beneath a beautiful dome that provided an excellent illusion of natural light at any time of day. The Grand Staircase's centerpiece was a large carved panel with a clock. Passengers would either descend the staircase or take the very modern elevators to enter the first-class dining room. Interestingly, the Titanic film went to great lengths to ensure the Grand Staircase's accuracy, working from original plans and materials. First-class passengers would congregate in this Edwardian-style lounge to play cards and discuss the day's hot topics. The promenade, bridge, shelter, saloon, upper, middle, and lower decks housed passenger accommodations and public areas. The remaining 3 were set aside for the crew, cargo, and machinery. The boat and promenade decks were located above the ship's superstructure. Their measurements did not extend the entire length of the ship. The Titanic's boat deck was the topmost deck. It got its name because it housed lifeboats. The boat deck was the ship's only real open space. On the boat deck, first and second class passengers could stroll, rest on benches, play quoits, a game similar to horseshoes, or lose themselves in quiet contemplation. Third class passengers promenaded on the bridge deck because they were not permitted on the boat deck. The bridge deck was a poop deck-like platform located aft of the ship. They were, however, forced to share this crowded space with cargo and equipment. The Titanic's state-of-the-art gymnasium, located on the boat deck, was used by first-class passengers. It had the standard dumbbells, rowing machines, and so on, as well as a mechanical horse and camel. To use the gymnasium, you had to pay 1 shilling, about 25 cents, to Thomas Macaulay, the on-site gymnasium steward, who was dressed in white flannels. Exclusive first-class and men-only Turkish baths were available on the Titanic. Male first-class passengers who paid the $1 fee could access rooms with hot, temperate, and cool temperatures, as well as a steam room, a private toilet, and even a shampooing room. The Turkish baths also included a freshwater drinking fountain made of marble, ornate tiles in the Arabic style, and comfortable lounge chairs for passengers to rest. A dining saloon, reception room, restaurant, lounge, reading and writing room, smoking room, and veranda cafes and palm courts were among the first-class public rooms. And if a parlor suite wasn't enough, a wealthy family could buy several first-class cabins next to one another and open the interconnecting doors between them to create their own suite. The Café Parisien was a trendy dining area on the Titanic that resembled modern Parisian boutique cafes. First-class passengers could use the veranda cafe and palm court on the Promenade A deck. These rooms' large windows, wicker furniture, trellis work, potted plants, and checkered floors suggested they were in the English countryside. First-class children preferred the veranda cafe and frequently congregated there to play. The lounge, a luxurious room on the promenade deck designed for socializing, was also available to first-class passengers. This opulent oak-paneled room featured alcoves where passengers could converse privately. The lounge decor was inspired by the Palace of Versailles. The lounge served coffee, tea, and liquor. The reading and writing room was specifically designed for first-class female travelers. It was painted white and tastefully furnished. The occupiers had access to the promenade deck through a large bow window. A large fire was burning brightly, adding warmth to the room. The first-class lounge was located on the promenade deck and was lavishly furnished. This room was set aside for reading, conversation, playing cards, and other daily social interactions. It was decorated in the Louis XV style of France. The craftsmanship was superb. The walls were covered with boiseries, giving the room a symmetrical appearance. The magnificent first-class smoke room was located near the back of the promenade deck. The walls of the first-class smoking room were paneled in mahogany carved in the Georgian style and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. And the approached in the New World painting by Norman Wilkinson hung above the centerpiece fireplace. Those looking for something to drink after dinner could do so at the well-stocked bar. Others enjoyed strolling around the room, admiring the painted glass windows depicting various ports from around the world, as well as other White Star Line ships. A small veranda area on the port side of the room led to the palm court areas overlooking the aft promenade deck. The room appeared to be part of a conservatory due to the walled trellises with climbing plants. Passengers could finish their drinks on wicker chairs. And the first-class reception area behind the grand staircase was a 54-foot-long room. The room was decorated in the Jacobean style with a white ceiling and a dark rusty carpet. Before dinner, saloon passengers could gather to talk about the day's events on the ship, and some would sit in one of the many floral-patterned grandfather chairs available.